I think the worst boardroom myth is the board knows best. Anything that has the smack of it's what the board wants, so it must be right and we'll have to do it, I think is a myth to charge at.
My guest today is Ilse Howling, Chair of Frontier Developments, the AIM-listed video games company behind Planet Zoo, Planet Coaster and the Jurassic World Evolution franchise.
I had sort of the friend of a very wise Ned that I've worked with over the years who'd said, in your first meeting, just keep your head down, don't ask anything controversial, which I completely ignored.
Ilse spent over a decade as Managing Director of Freeview, the joint venture between ITV, Channel 4, BBC, Sky and Arqiva, growing it from start-up to the UK's largest TV service before leading the creation of Freeview Play. Along the way, she worked with 14 different chairs, an experience she has described as an absolute sheep-dip masterclass in what to do and what not to do at the top of a board.
A great chair is never going to force an issue in the room if you haven't got the support there. A great chair is not going to back people into a corner. If you back someone into a corner, they're either going to clam up or, probably worse, they'll come out fighting.
At Frontier, she joined as non-executive director in 2022 and was elevated to chair in November 2023, right as the company entered one of the most demanding periods in its history. A strategic reset, the closure of its third-party publishing label, a redundancy process that reduced the workforce by hundreds, and a 20% cut in operating costs, all while managing a CEO transition and answering to public markets. The company returned to full-year profitability in 2025, and the judges of the 2026 Ned Awards recognised her stewardship of that turnaround by naming her AIM Non-Executive Director of the Year, commending in particular her clarity and courage, her ability to unite a divided board, and her balance of empathy and challenge with a CEO. Welcome to Enter the Boardroom, the podcast for boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Neural, home to the Enter the Boardroom community, the destination for serving and aspiring board directors. Ilse, welcome to Enter the Boardroom.
Lovely to be here.
Can we start by talking about your experience of boards as an executive? As Managing Director of Freeview, you had 14 chairs, which you've described as an absolute sheep-dip masterclass in what to do and what not to do as a chair. Can you give us the sharpest lessons from each end of that spectrum, the best and the worst that you've observed?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's like, who shall I throw under the bus from the great and the good in that list? I mean, just to sort of stand back and think about, you learn from that experience what makes a great chair. And I've now chaired many organizations myself and been a Ned. And you kind of develop a theory of what is going to make a great chair. And to me, I think just sort of there are three things, and a lot of this was learned from that Freeview time as managing director. So critically, what are you there to do more than anything else? You are there to create the space for great decision making sustained over time. And a lot of that is about creating, if you like, the safety in that room that those brains collectively can do their best decision making. And you open up the real power of the brains in that room. And I witnessed that sometimes at its best and sometimes at its worst at Freeview. So that's first thing. Second thing, you're going to do way more listening than you are talking. You are, I think the analogy of you're conducting an orchestra and you are absolutely not lead violin. And then the third thing, and this applies actually on any board, even when your directors are being chosen for you as shareholder representatives, if you're chair, you need to pick that team. You're going to pick the team around the table and you are going to pick the exec team in the organization. So a little bit of context for people about Freeview. Freeview's founded a long, long time ago. I mean, we're talking about 2002. It came from a joint venture thrown together at the last minute bid of some arch competitors coming to bid for each for their own reasons. And so the BBC, Sky, Arqiva, the digital transmission platform, Channel 4, ITV. So if you look at that, at its worst, you could call it a bag of ferrets fighting in a sack, and what it became was one of the most successful media joint ventures in UK history. So we went from pretty much 0 to 20 million homes at its peak. So the company formed breakneck speed. We had to get the governance right. This was a new joint venture, 2 directors per shareholder, and anything that was judged by the shareholders to be of strategic significance was going to be a reserved matter. And anything that was a reserved matter must have unanimous agreement among those directors, which sounded all fine on paper. But over the years, that became really tough. And what you learn, having watched different chairs, different non-execs, and we had some amazing names. I mean, there's a sort of roll call of the brightest and best across the media industry. You had one future Director General of the BBC in there, future chief execs of Channel 4, Channel 5, big media names today. If you like, Freeview was the sort of ground where companies were putting their brightest and best to learn how to be directors. I think what I learned most was you need to be really clear in advance with the chief exec, the managing director, as chair, what are you aiming to achieve? And you need to think through as a long game how you are going to get a united answer on some of those questions. I can go into some of the detail. How much would you like to hear?
Can you bring it to life for us? What does being clear in advance with a CEO about what you're going to achieve mean in practice?
You need to have a really good, so if you're managing director, if you're the exec team in that context, you need to have a really good relationship with your chair. And you need to be clear to what extent that chair sees the greater good of the whole and is really prepared to live with the fiduciary duty of the organization and its mission. So we rapidly worked out that the mission that united all those shareholders was how to grow the Freeview platform as fast as possible. And it would need evolution along the way. So despite the fact that several of those shareholders their business models were being eroded by the ability to pause and rewind and to fast forward through adverts, actually, we knew from all our consumer insight that was a key thing to have. So you need to know and plan, and it's a long game, and you need to learn the art of the pre-meet. You need to learn the art of the pre-meet to the pre-meet and how you will get alignment on those key decisions, because the greater good of the platform's growth meant that quite often shareholders had to sacrifice their individual goals for what they wanted out of the organization. And that could take months in the planning. And then, of course, you had to bring the supply chain behind you, and you had to get the message across to customers. So you learnt a great chair is never going to force an issue in the room if you haven't got the support there. A great chair is not going to back people into a corner. I mean, my personal view on that, if you back someone into a corner, they're either going to clam up or, probably worse, they'll come out fighting and stuff starts getting said that is actually really unhelpful, and it's very difficult to rewind from it.
You've talked in the past about what you learnt from Sky's presence in that joint venture, and I think you characterised it as a ruthless focus on the customer, as something that stayed with you for your whole career. Can you share with listeners what specifically was it that you observed, and how has it shaped now how you operate in the boardroom?
Yeah. And so way back when, my first ever job was as a customer service manager in a venture capital funded online startup company. By the way, I remember the day the venture capital funding got pulled and there was huge shouting in the boardroom. And the boardroom was this sort of hallowed room that we used to creep past. And we were not allowed usage data because it was so you had to run customer service blind without knowing what customers were actually using. We found a way around that, clearly. Sky, working with Sky in some ways for me, so my background pre-BBC was very commercial. And in some ways, working with Sky was a bit like coming home. And Sky, unlike the other board members in Freeview, kept more or less the same directors on Freeview's board all the way throughout. And there was a particular individual who is sadly no longer with us, from whom I learnt an enormous amount. Very experienced FTSE 100 director. And he'd worked in retail. So his obsession with, well, okay, you've got this fancy idea over here and you're going to do this and this, but how's that going to land with the customer? And very early on, when Freeview launched, Sky led how we would be marketed in retail. Believe it or not, Sky's own people were doing how to tell the story of Freeview. And they just came back with, well, hang on a minute, this is really intellectually highfalutin and a bit garbled. Where are your key selling messages? Oh, yes, we better have some of those. And they set up the call center, and we went and actually commissioned the call center, and the grilling, that learning from them, watching how will you actually represent Freeview to the people ringing up, learning from them, go and sit and answer calls in the call center. And that stayed with me when I chaired the high-speed fiber company. I went out with the door-to-door sales team and was selling the product on the doorstep, going in with the installation team. I'd like to say with Frontier now that I play all Frontier's games. Actually, I don't, but I do avidly read what people are saying in social media and online on Steam about our games. And Sky always would come back to, how is this going to land with the customer? And another thing I learned in those days, now remembering this is sort of initially largely pre-social media, but it's hugely important today, is you've got the ability to use technology as a dynamic, instant feedback loop. So if you try a new product and it doesn't work, fail fast, learn from the feedback, do something different. If your selling messages are not getting through, learn, do something different. And Sky were just all over that. And again, how that added value into that joint venture was it made us absolutely obsessed with how is this working for customers? And others perhaps around that table were more interested in what it was doing for their strategy. And we took some decisions where we defined the minimal viable proposition probably more tightly and sacrificed some growth because we were not going to sacrifice consumer standards and the quality, the sense of quality for our customers.
It's really interesting. You echoed there, I think, a theme that has emerged from episode 170 with Julian Metcalf. We talked about prep board members getting in front of the till every year, where Neil Johnson in episode 162, the RAC, where he used to go in the patrol cars and meet up with the patrolman in their sort of the lunch breaks, and Ian Cheshire in episode 158, where he talks about how retailers go through these cycles where
I love the way you have this encyclopedic knowledge of which number is which episode. It's incredibly impressive.
Spending too much time thinking about them, but it's interesting there that you sort of, you know, by getting into that call center, or the way they got into that call center, it's another reminder of just how important that is to do, and yet how few people do it, because it does take time and effort. I'm interested, though, that you don't play games.
I have played Jurassic World Evolution 3. I have got very good at riding my quad bike, trying to build fences and actually knocking down more fences and letting dinosaurs run riot. I mean, it was fascinating. So I'd been approached to join the board of a games company. And at the time I was thinking, what do I know about games? This is just, this is not going to work. And it was actually my sons are avid gamers, perhaps less so now as they're getting into their 20s, but they were saying, God, what are you going to say to them when they ask you if you play games? Are you going to admit that all you can do in Call of Duty is shoot your own feet? So I did admit that. It was the first question they asked me, are you a gamer? And you just think, there's absolutely no point pretending to be a gamer. But had I researched gaming? So at the time, one of the things I was doing as part of my portfolio part-time was I was teaching business to 17-year-olds who were absolutely beside themselves that I was going along to be interviewed for a games company. And I remember one of my students saying, you need to know about NVIDIA. You really do need to understand NVIDIA. And I'd be sort of trying out Frontiers games on that group, and they're kind of, oh, well, I think they know. So it's like this massive focus group in gaming. And the other thing that eventually dawned on me was, yeah, I am not you wouldn't want me on your team in Call of Duty, but the business model that television and broadcast media has gone through, and the transformation that technology, that kind of whirlwind of change that Freeview went through, the Netflixization of television, gradually as I began to research and talk to everybody and anybody I could track down who knew anything about gaming, you suddenly dawns on you, hang on a minute, gaming is going through exactly that same change. So yeah, it felt like, had I done my mystery shopping? Yeah, I had done my mystery shopping. And again, that straight line back to Sky, mystery shop, find a way of doing it.
You joined the Frontier board around the moment of a founder CEO succession as a non-exec. Curious to hear what you learned from that experience that others listening might be able to take something from.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the founder, is there a playbook? Is there a personality type of the founder? And I think the founder is typically a great human being. And throughout my career, I've worked with founders. The founder who was shouting way back in that VC capital funding being pulled, he was a messianic and terrifying figure who stalked the offices of that online company. And I mean, at 23 years old, I was in dread of how to impress him and his capacity to, anyway, let's move on from him. Later on, I worked with an absolutely lovely founder in the BIS computer group, owned by one of the American telcos, big global computer services company. He'd founded that company. He'd now got investors in, but he was still chief exec. So founder, CEO, but ownership had moved. So he was no longer in sole control. And he used I worked very closely with him as an advisor. And he used to say to me, you need to understand, if it's your baby, you're going to be obsessive about it. And you're going to have this slightly odd relationship with it that you're just never going to feel what it feels like to be me. And of course, later on, I mean, I was one of a team of founders at Freeview and then went from being director to managing director. And I kind of by then knew what he meant. You do obsess, and you have these characteristics that you sunk your teeth into this thing and you are going to make it work, and you're unstoppable. in the best way. You find out sort of that door didn't work right. We'll find a way round. Let's be like water flowing through this. So by the time I joined Frontier, and bear in mind, I was interviewed by the founder who, when he got to the point where he said to me, so tell me how you see Frontier's strategy. What do you think we should do? And I was thinking, shall I duck this? No, it's like, no, just say what I think the strategy should be. And so I talked about my outside view of the strategy. And bearing in mind, this is David Braben, who gets described as the godfather of British gaming. He looked down the screen. We're in the pandemic, so we're being interviewed online. And he looked down on the screen and he said, no, Ilse, you're totally wrong. It's absolutely not that. You need to understand. And he gave me a sort of really strong, and I just thought, well, clearly not got that gig then. So, but, to my delight. And that's the classic. Actually, if you're working with founders, they don't want you just to say yes. Founders are so obsessed, they're going to take feedback from anywhere, because if there's that possibility that you know something they don't, they want to know it. And so that intellectual challenge was there. So when I joined Frontier, David, I think he'd already decided he was going to step back as chief executive. And he was very clear, and the board were fully supportive of the person he was going to hand over to. And we looked at some other candidates, but it was very clear that to hand over to Johnny Watts, who I then worked with very closely as chief exec, was the right thing to do. And what was fascinating for me was watching the then chair and how they just gently steered that transition through. I mean, people talk about chief executives as driven and extraordinary individuals, and they are typically, but a founder is a whole different ball game.
Every week, I sit down with chairs in mastermind groups. Invariably, they say the same thing. They wish they'd discovered these groups sooner. If you've made it into the boardroom, you're almost certainly already a high performer with a growth mindset. But where can board members like you go for practical professional development? There's no obvious place to learn, develop, or share challenges with peers who genuinely understand them. That's exactly why we created the Enter the Boardroom community. If you want to keep improving as a board member, head to etb.newroll.com and take a look at our Fellows membership, designed for experienced board members like you. It sounds like you had that very different view of where the strategy should be headed from the outside. And you did subsequently oversee, when you became chair, a strategic reset, because Frontier's move to diversify its game portfolio, including through third-party publishing and new games in adjacent genres, had not delivered the anticipated success. And that diversification strategy had been running for 5 years before the reset. Really interested to sort of get into your mindset as chair at that point in time, because when you've got a board who's taken it on that journey, it's really hard to step back and reset. For a board member listening, what have your lessons been from that experience?
Yeah. Powerful lessons, I think. I mean, just let me set a little bit of the context. So back in that think back to I'm being approached about would I join a games company, and I'd managed to track down somebody I know who's chief exec of a big global mobile games company. And he was very well aware of Frontier, and the day that I was chatting to him, this is pre the interview, he said, let's just have a look at their share price, because the share price will be really high at the moment. And he was talking to me all about the context of the pandemic, massive surge across the sector of share prices for games companies, NFT boom, metaverse, huge sort of hype in the sector. And I remember him just checking literally in the meeting we were online, and he said, hang on, their share price has just dropped. Have you seen they've issued a profit warning? And I hadn't. And we were looking at it, and that was back end of 2021. And because my background has fundamentally been marketing and consumer insight, I had been talking to a whole group of colleagues around how do you understand audiences of gaming? How do you use the telemetry? How do you ensure that you've got sustained investment in games that are going to land well with audiences? And I remember my first ever Frontier board meeting, and I had sort of the friend of a very wise Ned that I've worked with over the years who'd said, in your first meeting, just keep your head down. Don't ask anything controversial, which I completely ignored. And towards the end of the meeting, there'd been a discussion going on. And I remember saying, forgive the kind of naivety of this question and the kind of honeymoon nature of this question, but who's speaking for the audience? Who's speaking for our players in this room? Who among the exec is really owning the audience? And somebody who is no longer there said to me, Ilse, the audience is not in this room. The audience is outside. They're the people who play our games. And I thought, how shall I proceed with that? And it was just sort of, note to self. And what I did about it was over the next 2-3 months, remembering that as non-exec, you need to stay out of the detail. Nonetheless, I, as part of my induction, had 2 3-hour sessions with the audience teams to try to really understand what does Frontier know about its games. I was brought in with a mandate to bring external thinking in to a group that was primarily around games thinking. And so over that time, I got a hang of the picture of how much or how little we did know about who was playing our games, and the extent to we were depending on desk research versus being able to harness our own data, and sat through what happened over the next year, 18 months. And bearing in mind, games commissioning is very similar to all media, traditional media. You're commissioning something long in advance. You know the roadmap long in advance of actually launching. And we went through a couple of launches where we sat and listened to people saying, this is going to be marvelous. It will do this. It will work with this audience, and it'll be absolute. It's going to knock it out of the park. And they didn't. And so a sense of, even as the overall share price across the sector was, if you like, getting back to kind of normal, it had surged and was coming down. So Frontier themselves, sadly, for a company that had done so well with a really stellar performance pre-pandemic, had a number of missteps. And as a board, to sit and watch those missteps and to try to understand properly what went wrong is really challenging. And for the people in the room who believed passionately in what they were doing and believed that the engineering and development excellence, and yet the understanding of the players just wasn't there to blend with that. And so a sense of, I think, overstretch in that diversification strategy. So we hit a point where, and it's well documented, a particular game that we released and had really high hopes on and had invested a lot of money in just didn't work. And it became very clear, urgently clear, in a way that it becoming increasingly urgently clear, we had to change strategy. We had to take really radical action.
So talk to me about that radical action, because you ran a 20% cost reduction and redundancy process over a 5-month period, which for a listed company with 900 staff at the start, that's material.
Yeah. It was material, and having worked very closely with Johnny Watts through that transition, bearing in mind Johnny then had been with the company for 25 years, an absolutely brilliant maker of games and brilliant, incredibly passionately people-focused chief executive. For him, it was really tough because the things he'd had such high hopes for and his deep commitment to the company was suddenly all in question. And what happened, and this was from the board's point of view, I think we were exceptionally lucky. The exec team gripped that problem and were beating down the board's doors. If they hadn't have been, we were beating their doors down with a very urgent, a strategic reset here is essential. Cut to the chase of what is really working. And our underlying games are what are called creative management simulation games. Another way of saying that would be games that perhaps grandparents would buy for their children. So Planet Zoo, Planet Coaster, Jurassic World were doing incredibly well. But the pieces where we had tried for the very best reasons to diversify weren't doing well. And we knew we had to cut our losses. The bit where we were taking 20% out of the overhead with those redundancies is really tough. And you've got a company that has been, if you like, a family business and then become PLC, yet some of the relationships across that group, these are people who've worked together for years. The interesting thing in that situation is how all that loyalty and all that belief actually channels to something that becomes hugely positive, because you're in a mode that says, if we don't do this, if we don't make these cuts, the company will not be able to turn around. So it becomes a sort of existential feeling that if you don't do this, you will not succeed. And it was the exec team themselves who came to the board and said, we are proposing a 20% in parallel with taking 20% out of the overhead. We as execs will take a 20% pay cut. And they came to us with that. And my sense is in all the organizations that I've chaired, that is exceptional. And we were really unusual behavior. In a situation where, having taken those rapid decisions and all those modes of how do you communicate offline, this is not you wait for the next board meeting. This is you are in, if you like, crisis mode, and all your, how are you going to communicate? Are you going to have the board together on a Sunday? Yes, you are. You will have all those offline follow-up modes with constant communication across the group to effect those changes. And as a result of that, somewhere, forgive me, I don't have the exact number, somewhere around 200 job losses. That's very challenging. And it's interesting when you think across what a board is there to do, and a board often will be about stretch, about scrutiny. I'm using Julia Unwin's 5S model: stretch, scrutiny, strategy, support, and stewardship. And so you are stewarding the value of the organization for shareholders and for staff, even as you are saying to staff in really difficult conversations, there is no longer a role for you at this organization. And so what the kind of pressure that puts on you, or the duty it puts on you as chair, but actually for the whole board, I think is really significant, because I think in any situation, I've been made redundant myself way back in that VC funded online startup, and I didn't see it coming. And I was shocked. I was so ashamed. At 25 years old, I didn't have a job, and I had to go and say to my mum and dad, I've just lost my job. And that lives with you. At Freeview, I'd made changes. I'd led those changes and had the conversations with people around there isn't going to be a role for you. And interesting, again, that model of how the Freeview board supported me. There was a particular director who probably is the last person one would have imagined this, saying to me at the time, it's going to be really tough. You're going to find that really difficult. With those conversations, I'll come along with you and I'll be in the room. Now, in the end, he didn't, and I had those conversations. But working with Frontier's exec team through those changes, so there's a balance between as the board, holding them to account, hold the feet to the fire, the phrase would be, of are you actually getting the transition fully through? That temptation, we're nearly there, we won't quite go the last bit. Yeah, so you're doing all that feet holding to the fire, but much more, you're doing the bit where you're saying, Johnny and I would have conversations where I would just be saying, are you okay? What do you need? And you're there, just a sounding board.
Ilse, time has flown. Before we move on to the lightning round, I should mention for members of Enter the Boardroom community, they now have access to our Enter the Boardroom podbot. So if they are not yet as sophisticated as you or want access to the full past library, you can now go into the community and find the podbot and interrogate it and have the benefit of being able to ask 200 or so board members how they would approach any problem you're wrestling with. So I'm going to ask you a short question and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Yeah, I think I'm ready. I'm kind of braced for this. This is the lightning round, yeah?
Exactly. First up, best book every board member should read and why?
Okay, I'm not going for a book. I'm going for a TV series. And forgive me being late to the party. I have literally just finished watching every episode of Game of Thrones. And despite all the killing and the horror and the brutality, why is it relevant for a board is again and again great leaders in Game of Thrones, men, women, other, are saying, let's stop. Let's consider with close, trusted advisors, is this the right thing to do? And the great leaders in there are listening to their advisors and they change their mind based on that discussion. So that's my Game of Thrones piece of wisdom.
Boardroom behavior that irritates you most?
Somewhere between a hobby horse and a soapbox. So grandstanding, telling, not listening.
A question every board should ask at least once a year.
We're about to do this actually at Frontier. It's partly, are we adding value? And if we did add value, when did we last do it? But it's also back to this point about safety is, are you as a board, as a member of this board, do you feel able, safe to say what you really feel in the room? Or are you in some way self-censoring? And when did you last do it and what happened?
A boardroom myth to bust?
I think the worst boardroom myth is the board knows best. Anything that has the smack of it's what the board wants, so it must be right and we'll have to do it, I think is a myth to charge at.
Favourite quote?
I'm going to War and Peace. Favourite quote in War and Peace, which I finally finished after 10 years trying to read it, is the strongest warriors are time and patience.
Board advice that sounds right but is wrong?
found it quite hard to answer because having been on many boards over time, what you realize is that a piece of advice for one context with one culture and one group could be spot on, but actually later on in a different context is going to be totally off. So I'm kind of in the mode of, if somebody gives you board advice, the question to ask is, how does that apply to my boards right now? Could I use it? And if not, let's not worry about it at the moment.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
A huge one for me, when I first was part of a board, trying to remember which board, I remember being told in no uncertain terms, Ilse, you must remember the board is not a team. We are not trying to build this board as a team. And all your team building stuff, it doesn't work here. Now, I've now been a NED for 20 years. I've chaired 4 boards. I fundamentally disagree with that. I think the board is a team. I think your role as chair, as every member of that board, is to make it the highest performing team you can. And critical to that is going to be, it's all about mission, it's all about strategy, but you're going to need to give feedback.
Best interview question to ask a prospective NED?
One of my favorite questions is, I will say to somebody, talk me through from when you first heard that this role might be coming up to now you're sitting with me now and you're talking to me. What have you done to prepare? And I want to hear that they've done mystery shopping. I want to hear that they have talked to and tracked down everybody they know in that sector to understand our challenges. And I don't just want to hear that they've done desk research.
And finally, one takeaway for our listeners, if they take nothing else from this episode.
Listen, listen, listen. I know Julian Metcalf had truth, but for me, it's listen. Because if you listen, you'll discover the truth.
Ilse, thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience and wisdom.
Thank you, Ollie. It's been an amazing privilege and experience. So thank you.
If you want a space to connect, test your thinking, and learn with board peers, the Enter the Boardroom community is built exactly for that. Listeners get 10% off. Visit etb.newroll.com and use the code ENTER at checkout.